Hi, everyone, and welcome back. Uh, this week we have been learning a lot about intercultural conflict and really trying to think about conflict on multiple different levels. We've spent a lot of time looking at how one simple thing, like an argument between two people, can be looked at kind of a micro level, so like this interpersonal level, at kind of a more meso level, so looking at like kind of intergroup dynamics and power imbalance, and also like macro levels, thinking about, for example, geopolitical relationships between countries and how that can feed in. And really kind of what cuts through all of that is this thing called power. And we've been talking about power a lot throughout the quarter. And what I've been trying to get you towards, and what we've been really kind of trying to think about, is how exactly power functions. How power functions, what our relationship to power is, and how that influences our interactions with one another. And so what we're going to be focusing on in this online lecture is really that question. How does power work? Because it's one thing to say that one group dominates over another. It's another thing to actually put that into practice and make it work. And so that's the question that we're going to be exploring. And we're going to be exploring that through the concept of disciplinary regimes. So in the first week of class, you had to read in chapter 1 about the 3 different definitions of culture. So you had the anthropological definition of culture, which was a system of shared meaning, cultural studies definition, which was culture as a site of contested meaning, and then you had the globalization studies definition, which was culture as a resource. And in that cultural studies definition, culture as a site of contested meaning, which is what this one is going to really kind of be focusing on today, you got introduced to that concept of hegemony. And hegemony really originated from an Italian activist and scholar, Antonio Gramsci. And Sorrell's, I defined it for you as dominance through consent. Right? So this idea that like one group dominates over another group, but how that domination kind of happens isn't through like physical force necessarily, although that does happen, but through this process of consent, by getting the oppressed to sort of agree, so to speak, take that word with a grain of salt though, to their oppression. And how that works isn't by getting people to just kind of like think about them like, okay, I'm okay with this, but more so by creating a system in which that dominance gets normalized as kind of the way things are. And that piece, normalization, is what we're going to focus on today. And normalization occurs through a process of discipline, that through that process of discipline, that dominance can come to be seen as the norm, as just the way things are. And to start that off, to kind of start off this discussion of discipline, I'd like you to do a little exercise. I'd like you to pause the video here and complete exercise 7.1, which is going to ask you some questions, kind of present a scenario to you to kind of think through, and think through what you would do in that scenario. So pause the video here and complete exercise 7.1. So now that you've completed that exercise, I want you to think through the factors that you kind of considered. I want you to think about, one, how you answered. Would you run the red light or wait for it to turn green? But also think through the different factors that you considered in making that decision. when I give this assignment to students, there's usually kind of three overall categories kind of involved in obeying traffic laws. And most students usually will answer that they would have just waited for the light to turn green, that they wouldn't have run it. And there's kind of, you can kind of put their reasoning into sort of three different categories. One is they considered like political institutions. So they, so government, law enforcement, things like that. They were concerned, like, just because, for example, just because we can't see a police officer doesn't mean he's not there. Maybe he's hiding. Or maybe there's cameras on the stoplight, so I'll be photographed. So they're worried about that kind of legal enforcement. Sometimes civil institutions come into it, right? So economic, so some will say, for example, they might say, well, if I got a ticket, then that would go on my insurance, and then I'd have to pay more for insurance. Or, values that they'd learned from family about the safety of others, things like that, or things that they'd learned from kind of some of the other institutions. So safety, not wanting to get hurt, not wanting anyone else to be hurt, what the consequences of that might be kind of socially if that were to happen. But there's another category there. There's another category involved in obeying the traffic laws. There's the political institutions and the civil institutions. And then there was you. You were kind of involved in this process of whether or not to run the red light. You were the one kind of involved in that sort of kind of legal social system of obeying these traffic laws. And those factors that you took into account, the law, the social consequences, all of that, the economic consequences, those were all discourses. Now, we've talked about discourse before. Those were all discourses. There were legal discourses involved. It's the law. Or if you break the law, there might be legal consequences. There were civil discourses such as safety of others, the economic question, the consequences, maybe social pressure and judgment. And you in that are a subject who then has to kind of navigate these discourses and make sense of them and make decisions kind of throughout your daily life. And that's really what's at the heart of disciplinary regimes. And disciplinary regimes comes from a man named Michel Foucault, who really you've kind of been low-key learning about all quarter. I haven't always kind of said his name or went into who he was into too much detail, but you really have been kind of learning about his work throughout the quarter. He was a French philosopher and political scientist who did a lot of extensive study on like the relationships between discourse and knowledge, like how what we know, quote unquote, know about the world and about how things are supposed to function comes from these discourses. He's extensively studied power, and he's extensively studied discipline. And it's that latter part, discipline, that I really kind of want to unpack today, because it's that discipline that's really at the heart of how power worked. And this is what Foucault argued about power. One is that he argued that power is not typically maintained through physical force, although that can happen. So physical force, an example would be, a government exerts control over its people through police violence. Right? That is the reality for a lot of people. Right? But it's not kind of the primary way the state functions. The second is that power is productive. So what that means is that power is something that's produced and reproduced, And it's produced through discourses. And those discourses are enforced through discipline. And so what that means is that power is ultimately discursive. It's a system that kind of comes through these historically situated discourses. So what discursive means is that it's really kind of a different way of saying contested meaning, like the cultural studies definition of culture. Discursive is like contested meaning around discourse. So it's like you can think of two different discourses, like in a boxing ring or something, duking it out, and one kind of wins and gains the currency of being true, and then the other one gets pushed to the margins. It's not really visible. It's not one people see. It's this other one that kind of wins the medal of truth. And what it means for it to be historically situated is that those discourses that can kind of gain the power of truth have a lot to do with like where we are. So for example, economically, kind of where we are as a society in terms of like infrastructurally, economically, socially, and that changes then throughout time. So discourses aren't something static, but rather something that changes without time. And what those discourses do, we say them out loud, we put them out into the world, and we normalize them. And when we normalize them, through this process of discipline, which I'm going to explain in a second, people will end up monitoring themselves and each other. They'll end up monitoring themselves and each other because this discipline produces what's called docile bodies. And docile bodies comes from his book, Michel Foucault's book, Discipline and Punish in 1975, where he studied the function of prisons and how you can see prison as kind of a microcosm of how power works in society as a whole. And he dedicated an entire chapter of this book in Discipline and Punish to the panopticon. The panopticon is a physical structure, and there's a photo of it here on the right. And this is a photo of the Illinois State Penitentiary. And the panopticon is that cylindrical structure right in the center. And so that is where the prison guard is. And all of those those doors around it are prison cells. And so panopticon is a cylindrical structure that gives a prison guard a 360-degree view of the entire prison. The windows are typically tinted, so the prison guard can see out, but the prisoners can't see in. And what ends up happening then is that it allows one guard to monitor hundreds of prisoners, but two, it creates this kind of system in which prisoners always know that they're being watched. And what Foucault argued is that this is really kind of a microcosm of how power works. This kind of constant knowledge of surveillance, that prisoners in the system always know that they're being watched. They always know that there are eyes on them. And so as such, what happens is that when prisoners are under this type of surveillance by the prison guard, they monitor themselves and they monitor each other. So they monitor the other people around them just as much as they're monitoring themselves. And that's what docile bodies is. You do that so much that it just kind of becomes part of your everyday. You can do it without even thinking about how you're doing it. And it's that process where it becomes normal and everyday that makes it normalized. And so as we move into the second part of the lecture, we'll get a little bit deeper into how that discipline happens.